Howdy, everyone. Let's wrap up Chapter 1. Last time we talked about negative feedback systems and homeostasis and the importance of homeostasis in living things like us. And this slide shows a negative feedback system that has two individual negative feedback loops, two different hormones, both responsible for maintaining blood calcium homeostasis. The concentration of calcium ions in our blood is really important because muscle cells and nerve cells depend on calcium ions for their functioning. So if we don't have enough calcium in our blood, we get messed up pretty quick. So I'm just going to ask you to stop the video and take a look at this and see if you can answer those two questions that are on the left side of the slide there. So pause and check it out. Did you pause and check it out? I don't know. Dang, that woman is naked. Sorry, surprised me. So the next thing, the next few things that we're going to cover in this chapter take up quite a few slides on this presentation, but will not take very much time because this is really almost all just knowledge, things that you need to remember. And if you would like some tips, some hints, some advice about how to remember things for a class like this, I can help you out with that. Let me know. I have some very good suggestions. So we're going to look at tissue types first, and then we'll talk a little bit more about the organization of the body and a few other things, but we'll go through this really quickly. Remember, pause the video whenever you need to write down some notes, to jot down a question, to check out something in your textbook or online so that you understand all the things as we're going through. So there are 4 different types of tissues that make up the organs that make up us. And those 4 types are muscle, nerve, connective, and epithelial tissue. We'll spend very little time on the first 2, muscle and nerve, because we'll cover them in more detail in some chapters later on, but I think you're familiar with muscles. Muscles can contract and help us with movement, moving our body or moving things around in our body. Nerves are made of specialized cells that can transmit electrical impulses and pass messages by chemical means from cell to cell. It's the rapid communication system in our body, and we'll talk lots about nervous tissue, nerve cells, and nerve function later on. We'll spend a little more time on what are perhaps the 2 less familiar tissue types for you, epithelium and connective tissue. Epithelium, maybe you know another word that begins epi. Your epidermis is showing. That was a good joke when I was in elementary school. Epi means covering or outside. And epithelial tissues tend to be coverings and linings. So the coverings of organs or the linings of the insides of organs, tubes, and things like that tend to be epithelial tissues. And there's a lot of stuff mapped out on this particular slide, and we're going to look at some of them individually. It doesn't hurt to know them all, but you're unlikely to be hurt terribly badly if you don't remember them all either. Because you can look them up, but knowledge does give you greater understanding, and there is something to just knowing things and not having to search your mind for it, not having to search the internet for it. So if it's a huge burden, I wouldn't worry about trying to memorize a lot of this. If you're someone who remembers things pretty easily, then it may be a good use of your time. So there are 2 main categories of epithelium, simple and stratified epithelium. Simple is one layer of cells, and luckily the names of these three types of cells, simple squamous, simple cuboidal, and simple columnar, those names pretty much tell you what the cells are like. Squamous or squat, squashed cells. So that's pretty easy to remember. They're flattened cells. Cuboidal cells are kind of cube-shaped or kind of square. And then columnar are kind of column-shaped cells. Not too tough. And then stratified, if you know the word strata from other areas of science, you are perhaps familiar with that meaning layers. Stratified epithelium would be layered epithelium. And the two pictures here are depicting the epithelial lining in the vagina. And you can see that there's layer upon layer of cells forming a protective barrier. Whenever we have the outside of our body being exposed to the inside of our body, we want to protect ourselves from infection, so we tend to have lots of layers of cells stacked on top of each other. That's the way our skin is. That's the way some of the linings of the openings of our body are as well. So there's another stratified squamous epithelium here, the skin. The outer layers of our skin are keratinized. Keratin is a protein, and that outer layer of skin is really nothing more than a bunch of dead cells that have been packed with this protein called keratin. Keratin is a very useful protein. We make lots of stuff out of keratin. The dead covering of our skin is made of mostly keratin. Our nails, our fingernails and toenails are made of keratin, so is our hair. And showing that life on Earth tends to stick with a theme if it works. And we are connected by our past, our evolutionary past. Almost everything that grows out of the surface of a vertebrate animal is made of keratin. So the scales of reptiles, the feathers of birds, and those are all made of the same protein, keratin. Epithelial membranes can be the basis for some of the important glands that we have in our body. And we have two different types of glands, two categories of glands that we'll talk about as we move through the course: exocrine glands and endocrine glands. Exocrine glands are ones that produce something that is released to the outside of the body. So a sweat gland is an exocrine gland. And you can see that the exocrine glands form when a layer of epithelium forms a pocket, and then an opening, a duct, forms inside that pocket. So the first step looks the same, whether it's going to form an endocrine or an exocrine gland. We have this group of cells forming sort of an invagination there. And then if those stay connected to the outside, then that's an exocrine gland. And if they're separated from the outside and produce substances that are released to the inside of our body, into our blood or into our body fluids, then those would be endocrine glands. And an example of an endocrine gland is one that makes hormones. That's our endocrine system, perhaps you are aware. There are three different basic structures of exocrine glands. This is in the book. We may see this at some point, but it's not a particularly important idea for you in a class like this. The next type of tissue, connective tissue. Again, the name is very helpful. Connective tissues tend to connect different parts of our body. So muscles are connected to bones by connective tissue. Bones connect one part of our body to the other, so they're also connective tissue. Connective tissue is found in just about every major organ of the body, and we'll see some examples of different types of connective tissue. The picture that's on this page is showing loose connective tissue like we see in the dermis of our skin. That's the under layers of our skin. And that loose connective tissue provides a sort of framework for different types of cells and tissues to do their job in a particular part of the body. So in the dermis of our skin, we have nerves, we have blood vessels, we have cells of our immune system, lots of different types of cells in there doing their job. And the loose connective tissue provides a framework where those cells can grow and do what they need to do. Dense connective tissues are, as the name suggests, more dense. The cells are packed more closely together, and there tends to be also a matrix of protein, a lot of protein in the dense connective tissue, and that gives it structural strength and sometimes elasticity depending on the tissue. And denser connective tissues, you are familiar with some of these names probably. Tendons, which connect muscles to bones, ligaments, which connect bones to bones, and cartilage, which is that rubbery, springy tissue at the ends of our bones that protect them from grinding each other down. Fat is a loose connective tissue, adipose tissue. And bone is a dense type of connective tissue. Instead of making a lot of protein to go in between the cells in bone, there is a lot of mineral deposited. There's also a lot of protein as well, but there's a lot of minerals deposited between the cells, and it is a very dense, strong structure. All right, putting some of those different tissues together, we can look at skin as an example of a human organ. An organ is a collection of two or more different types of tissues working together to perform specific functions. Our skin has quite a few important functions: detecting stimuli, protecting us from the external environment, things like that. And in fact, human skin has all four tissue types in abundance, even though it's not thick in terms of its size. It covers a lot of surface area, so overall it's a huge organ. And you can see all four types of tissue in the diagram here. I'm not going to ask you to, name off the 4 strata in the epidermis there, so don't worry about that. But trying to get a sense for the complexity of a typical organ with all those different tissue types built in. Okay, stem cells are an important thing that you guys are introduced to in this chapter. Stem cells, as it says on the slide, are cells that have the ability to divide and to specialize into different types of cells. The ultimate stem cell is the fertilized egg. When you were a single cell, not long after the sperm fertilized that special egg, you were totipotent. That single cell could divide and ultimately differentiate into every one of the specialized cell types that make up your body. So as an early embryo, our cells are totipotent. They have this amazing ability to differentiate into anything. Once we become adults, that ability is very much decreased, and most of our adult stem cells have only a limited ability to differentiate into other cell types. And there's a good example of that in the diagram here, showing a hair follicle with this small region called the bulge region that has a collection of stem cells that replaces the various types of cells that make up the hair follicle as they die or as they divide to make up hair as it grows. So most adult stem cells are like this. They maintain a limited ability to divide and differentiate compared to those of our early embryonic days. So the organization of our body, you're probably familiar. Cells make up tissues, tissues make up organs, and organs are the components of organ systems. So we have this hierarchy that's probably a good thing to remember. And this slide summarizes some of the major organ systems in our body. Much of this you are probably familiar with, and almost all of it we're going to look at in a lot more detail later on. All right, so I want to finish up with this slide and have you guys think. Think about what are the questions that you might be able to ask yourself and ask your classmates that will help bring you back to the important knowledge, the key bits of understanding that you're going to need from this chapter. And you can go back into the video, go back to the first video from the chapter 1 and review anything that you need to think about. What are a few critical questions that might help you to organize some of this knowledge and understanding that you've gained in this first chapter? That is all.